Once upon a time, when God made all the flowers, they were waiting in heaven to go down to earth, and they were talking about where they were going to grow. And the rose said, "Oh, I'm so beautiful. I'm going to grow in the beautiful places, maybe on high hills, by apple trees, above rolling brooks. And when people see me, they will stop and think, oh, this world is marvelous." "Ooh," said the tulip, who was so strong and beautiful. "I think that sounds lovely. I'd like to grow in beautiful places too. I think that when humans build castles, great grey castles, I would like to grow on the lawns of castles, and then princesses and kings and queens can walk in amongst the flowers and admire me and think, the world is incredible." "Ooh," said the violet, who was a bit shyer. "I think I'd like to grow in secret places. Maybe I could grow in forests amongst the moss, maybe underneath branches, maybe at the bottom of oak trees. And when animals and people find me, they think, oh, wow, that's beautiful." "Sounds good," said the flowers. They all nodded. "Sounds good." Then it was the turn of the dandelion. And everybody said to the dandelion, "Where would you like to grow?" And the dandelion was very brave-hearted. And the dandelion said, I'm going to grow everywhere." The flowers looked a bit confused. "Everywhere?" said the rose. "That's a bit greedy." "Everywhere?" said the tulip. That's a bit common." No, said the dandelion. "I'm just going to grow like everywhere. I mean, not everywhere, but I can want to be able to grow in places where flowers don't normally grow. I want to grow in the dull, boring places. I want to grow in the edge of roads where the dust goes all the time and the cars drive maybe, and nobody will expect a flower. I want to grow in the cracks of broken earth, and I want to grow in lawns where there's nothing but grass, and suddenly I want there to be a dandelion." But the other flowers weren't sure about this at all. And the rose said to the dandelion, "How will people know if you grow everywhere how precious you are?" And the dandelion thought about this. And then she said, "Yeah, but what if there's a time that comes when there aren't as many flowers? What if there's a time when it's really hard for flowers to find a place to grow? And then I'll still be able to grow up from the broken places. And then I'll still be able to give pollen and food. So I think maybe it's good to grow everywhere in case one day I'm needed." The flowers looked at each other, and they didn't really like the idea of there being a time when it was hard for flowers to grow, because they were so beautiful and so many of them, and they couldn't really imagine it, so they changed the subject. God sent all the flowers down to earth, and they all grew in the places that they thought about growing. The rose grew on the high hill and the beautiful gardens, and the tulip grew on the lawns of beautiful grey castles. And the violets grew in the secret places in the woods with primroses and anemones and sometimes bluebells. And the dandelion grew everywhere. Not everywhere, but everywhere. Everywhere where you wouldn't expect a plant, everywhere in the broken paths and in the forgotten fields, and everywhere where the animals had trampled and the humans had kicked and walked, there was a dandelion. And I have to tell you that what the rose said was true. Because the dandelion grew everywhere, nobody realized how precious she was. People forgot it. In fact, the humans started calling dandelions and her other sisters and brothers who grew in so many places weeds. Weeds, they said, and they pulled them out and they pulled them out and they tried to get rid of them, and nobody saw actually how beautiful this dandelion is that looks just like the sun. But I also have to tell you that what the dandelion said came true. Because many, many years later, there was a time when it was really hard for flowers to find a place to grow. Of course, there were patches, there were gardens, there were special meadows, but the flowers couldn't grow in a great carpet across the world, which was what they needed to do in order to provide food and drink for all those who loved them and lived on them. They needed that, but they couldn't do that. And the reason they couldn't do that was because the humans were so busy building. And they built so many homes and they built so many houses and they built so much which was wonderful, but they forgot about the houses and the food for all the smaller things, the winged things, the flying things, the buzzing things. They forgot to leave homes for them. And so there was a time when it was really hard for the buzzing things and the flying things and the swarming things to find food. And the flowers found it really hard to grow, to find places to grow. Now, what happened was, in one forest, it was a forest, and then it got smaller because the humans cut down the trees, and then it became a copse of trees. And in this copse of trees, there was a beehive. And the beehives they'd been there for many generations. And they were used to flying to the wild fields and meadows around what had once been a forest, and now it was a copse, but there would still be meadows. But now there weren't meadows because the humans had wanted to build more houses and more houses, and that was fine, but they forgot to leave spaces for the flowers and the wild things. And so the bees didn't have anything to eat. And I don't know if you know about bees, but when they find something to eat, they come back and tell their friends. And the way they do this is by dancing. It's called a waggle dance. And in this hive, bees had gone out and looked for flowers, and they come back. But there'd been no dancing, not for many days, not since the estate had been built. And they would come out and come back hungry, and there hadn't been any dancing. And then one of the younger bees, she said to her sisters, I'm going to find some food. And her sisters were really tired, and they said to her, don't bother, there's nothing anymore. But the young bee said, I'm going to go and find it, and when I come back, I'm going to dance. When I come back, I'll be dancing. And so she buzzed out of the hive, and she buzzed outside of the trees, and she buzzed down the road, and she looked this way, and there were flat fields with just grass, and she looked that way and there were just roads. And she looked at the housing estate that had just been built, and she thought there must be something left there. There must be something we can eat. So she went into the housing estate and she flew along the cracks of the concrete that had just been made, and there were houses and there were lawns, but they were very well mowed, so there wasn't much growing on them, only grass. And she looked and she was really hungry, and she began to give up and think that there would be no dancing she could bring back to her sisters. But suddenly she glimpsed yellow, and she buzzed along, and there was a little patch that had been forgotten. Nobody had built there yet. There was only abandoned bits of concrete and ragged bits of earth and patches of forgotten grass. And there, amongst the patches of the forgotten grass, something had come growing. Something had come springing out of the ground with its great yellow crown. And that thing was the dandelion. There wasn't just one dandelion there. There were 2, there were 3, there were 4, there were 5, there were 50 or 60 dandelions in that forgotten patch. And the bee buzzed, and the bee landed on the dandelion, and the bee drank the delicious nectar that the dandelion was making. And then that bee buzzed and thanked the dandelion and did her dance on top of the dandelion, so the dandelion felt so happy. And then the bee buzzed back to her sisters, and when she came back, she danced. And they all said, she's dancing, what's she found? And they watched her dancing, and she danced and danced, and they all followed her dance, and they followed her into the housing estate, and they followed her to the forgotten patch, and there they all saw the dandelions, and they said, yes, dandelions are the bravest flower who can grow wherever they can. Thank you, dandelions. And they drank, and they ate. And ever since then, the dandelion has been celebrated as the flower who grows wherever she can. And people have begun to remember that just because flowers have the power to grow in many places doesn't mean they're weeds. It might mean that they're actually even more precious. So really hope that you enjoyed this story. And yeah, and dandelions and their friends, daisies and buttercups, can very often spring out of grasses when we leave them just a little bit of space. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed the story and I hope you have a lovely day. Goodbye.